Up next on Radio Dayz The Podcast.
My PD says to the record person, hey, is there any chance she can do a quick interview with Keith Urban? I looked at, no.
What are you doing that for? Why you're ruining my buzz.
And I said, so Keith, you smell good.
Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of radio as a medium. Here's your host, Ron.
Hello and welcome to Radio Dayz The Podcast. Of course, you can hear this podcast on BuzzSprout and all major podcast platforms. And you can also watch this podcast via YouTube, as well as RonRobinsonStudios.com. Very excited about this week's show as we welcome morning show host from 93.1. I still think it's DRQ, but we'll have to ask her about the call letters now. In Detroit, the very talented Renee Vitale. But before we welcome Renee, I want to share with you as to why I produced this podcast. Very simple. It's to promote the upcoming docuseries movie about the history of radio. It's called Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio. It started out as a movie. Now it's kind of sectioned off into a docuseries. It chronicles the history of radio from its inception back in 1920 through radio serials to the emergence of music and rock and roll, FM radio becoming the thing, all the way to current day radio programming. You hear the stories from those who lived it. Among the personalities that appear in this docuseries include Dick Burton, Ken Calvert, Paul W. Smith, Doug Podell, JoJo Shuddy McGregor, Fred Jacobs, Jill Forsythe, Terry Foster, John O'Leary, need to take a breath, Mike Halloran, Greg Henson, Chuck Santoni, Big Jim Edwards, Greg Russell, Brian Pastoria, as well as our guest today, Renee Vitale, and many, many more. In this episode of Radio Dayz The Podcast, though, which is brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group and Radio Dayz The Movie, today we're going to take a dive into the career of one Renee Vitale. And it's my version of it's your life kind of thing.
No.
To help me do this, I welcome the person of the hour, the recently engaged Renee Vitale. Hello.
Hey, Ron.
How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I think you're the first guest that I've had that does a morning show currently. I've had a lot of formers, and I've had people that are on the air, but I think you're the first that's doing a morning show currently while I had them on the air. So this is kind of a big deal. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a big deal to be on here.
Before we go in and talk about how and why you pursued a career in radio and what's happened to you since, let's talk about a little bit of what's going on here and now. As I mentioned, you're doing a morning show now, Goose and Renee. Mm-hmm. That's the newish. It's been, you guys been on a little bit, I think a couple months, but the newest show on 93.1. Is it still WDRQ?
Yeah, our call letters are WDRQ, but we're known as New Country 93.1. And yeah, we're still a new morning show. We're not even a year in. We started together in April. So what's the rule? A station is new for what, 2 years? Is that still the rule?
Right.
I believe.
So the larger the market, the shorter the lifespan, right? The larger the market, the shorter the time frame.
No kidding.
So what's that been like? I mean, I think you were doing mornings by yourself for a while there at 93.1, but then they paired you up with Goose. Talk a little bit about that partnership and how that's evolved and how do you feel things are going? Because you talk about a couple of years, it takes a little bit of time for two people to mesh and find out, okay, this is what you're doing, this is what I'm doing. That can be an awkward state, but you guys have seemed to do it, flawlessly. It's been very, very cool to listen to.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it was really a match made in heaven, for lack of a better term. But I was brought on before he was. It was like an arranged marriage. So the way that I even became in contact with my program director was I was filling in on 96.3 on Blaine Fowler's morning show because his co-host Lauren had gone on maternity. And so Blaine had called me up and said, hey, I'm going to have an empty bench for 2 months. Any interest in filling in? It was during the pandemic. And as you know, Ron, a lot of people were not working in radio. Thanks to
a lot
technology.
of people were losing their jobs. Yeah.
Losing their jobs. Some on a temporary basis, some on a full-time basis. Well, I was just doing part-time on air at that point. And I was working for Entercom. And at that point, they had just decided that all the full-time people, because of their capabilities with their home studios, would just, handle the duties of even the part-timers. So I was not working. And so I was completely free. I was doing sales and marketing for McRae Harbor in Harrison Township. And so, sure. I'd love to do this. So I essentially was able to do a 2-month audition for my program director, which is unheard of. And it was awesome. I mean, at most, you send a demo that's less than 10 minutes, depending on what it is, 5 to 7 typically, of your best stuff. Well, I was fortunate enough to be able to give him my best stuff for 2 months.
Right.
And so it was great because he knew he wanted me. He just didn't know who he wanted me with.
Right. And that was a process. He did
it was such a process. Of course, he asked me first who I may want. And there was a few names that I had tossed out to him. Either they were unavailable contractually, or, it just wasn't the right fit in his eyes. But yeah, the process was, it was pretty crazy for a while. And I just remember him saying, don't worry, it's going to happen. Don't worry, we're going to find them. And actually there were 2 people that were very close calls that I thought it was a done deal. In fact, one, the 3 of us, my program director, the person that was to be my co-host, and myself, we sat and had breakfast, lunch, and then her and I went out afterwards for drinks thinking, okay, this is us. We got to get to know each other because we're going to be doing a show. And then that didn't happen.
Can you share who that was, or you won't do that? Can you share who that was or no? Can you share who that was or no?
I probably shouldn't.
I was just going to say, let me interject then. If you're not going to mention the name of the person, let me interject this, because I was talking to you at that time. And look, don't get me wrong. I love the fact that you and Goose are paired up, but I still maintain that I would have loved to see you and Michelle McCormick do a show together.
This is actually before Michelle McCormick. This was someone else.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine and good, but I think she's back with Greg Henson now.
Oh yeah,
but you and Michelle would have been great, I think.
I agree with you, and you suggested her, and I knew of her. I was a fan of hers, but to talk to her one-on-one, I had never done that, and so you gave me her contact info. I was chatting with her and I was like, he's right. I could totally see this happening. Yeah. And again, it was one of those situations that it just didn't work out. But I am a fan of Michelle McCormick, mostly because of her being on with Greg Henson. That's what I know. Yeah. And they say everything happens for a reason. Obviously, none of us knew that was the reason at the time that she and I didn't work out together. God, it sounds like we were dating. But anyway, I'm so glad it didn't work out because I love those 2 on the air together. And I think that they need to be on the air together. So that worked out.
Yes. Now let's get back to your career. But before we do that, I always ask some preempt questions before people get into radio. Let's go back to a young Renee Vitale. What is your earliest memory of listening to the radio?
So I remember listening with my dad to 104.3. Actually, no, I'm sorry. It was 102.7 when it was oldies. Remember it was Kiss FM? I remember listening to Kiss FM with Paul, Christie, and Damone, and they were the morning show back then. I don't even know if any of them, are they still doing radio? I don't know. I don't know whatever happened to those guys. But I just thought it was the coolest thing. And I would listen. They kind of, if I remember correctly, had like a morning zoo type show. And I really liked it. And I just thought it was magic listening to these guys. And I knew I wanted to be on the radio. And so my dad had a CB in his car, like most people did at that time. And that to me was the closest that I could get to being on the radio. And my dad was also a ham radio operator. So I would sit there and watch him in the basement talking on the radio. And I listened to the CB when we were in the car. And I was like, wow, that's pretty close to talking on the radio. So I talked to the truckers on 94. I grew up in Roseville. We got 94 and 696 right there. So I would sit there and talk to these truckers and act like I was doing a radio show. And
that's awesome.
Hindsight, it was probably completely unsafe. I was like 12.
What handle did you? Yeah, what handle did you use? Do you remember your handle? Come on.
Wild Thing.
Wild Thing. Come on. That's perfect. Wild Thing.
Oh,
I love it. It's fitting. I mean, you could use that as a nickname. You could have Goose and Wild Thing. That'd be an interesting name for a title. Who knows?
Actually, I had a boat, and my boat, it was called Wild Oats because my ex-husband's nickname was Oats.
Right.
And we took Wild Thing and came up with Wild Oats. So
That's
it stuck
wonderful.
with me well beyond the CB years.
So it's one thing to be a fan of someone on the radio and be fascinated with the CB, a.k.a. radio, but tell me how and when and why did you pursue a career in radio? Because that's a big leap. Even there's a lot of fans of radio, very few go into the business.
Honestly, I had always been interested just, in the broadcast aspect of it. I thought it was pretty cool. My dad took me to cartoons on Gratiot, and they were doing a live broadcast out there. 102.7 was broadcasting out there. And so I didn't know that aspect of it. I just wanted to go because the radio station was there. And to see the old trucks with was that the Marty unit? What was that thing called?
Yeah, the Marty unit. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. To see that and see the DJs communicating with the board op in the studio and it sounding awesome and seeing them in person, it was so overwhelming cool. I was like, I have to do this. I want to do this. And so from that point on, I knew I always wanted to get into broadcasting. I would say that it was probably since I was about 12 years old, I knew I wanted to get into something like that. I really enjoyed English. Obviously, that goes hand in hand. I liked writing. I was in a lot of speech classes in school. So it was just, it was all kind of natural. A love of music, of course, doesn't help or doesn't hurt.
So before we get to 2000, where you actually started in broadcasting, let's go back. Talk about when and why you decided, okay, I'm going to go to Specs Howard, and talk about what that experience was like.
So I was actually accepted at Michigan State. I was going to get into their broadcast program, their communications program, I should say. My senior year, my dad was diagnosed with cancer, so he wasn't working. Obviously, any extra money that we had was going to medical bills and just keeping the family afloat. So I unfortunately wasn't able to take on, a 2-year program like that. Obviously, I had looked into Specs Howard, knowing what a specialty school that was. But again, back then you got your degree. That's what you did, right? And so I personally wanted to go to Specs Howard, but to appease my parents, I was going to go and get that degree. So when that became not an option, Specs Howard, I don't want to say was a backup plan, but ultimately, again, it worked out. It was what I wanted to do. And when I met with the, career advisors, the admissions reps at Specs, I just knew that this was exactly what I needed. The fact that I didn't want to go to school for 2 more years. I wanted to get working in the industry. And so it was a great option for me.
And I'm going to ask you specifically about when you came back to work there, but what was your first job in radio and what did you do?
My first job in radio was at 103.1 in Lapeer. At the time, it was called Wings 103. And it's funny because Dick Kernan from Specs Howard, at the time, great guy. I miss that man so much. He was helping the students get their jobs. He was directly the career services person. And back then, it was, hey, I got a kid. She's good. Hire her. And it was Dick Kernan. So you did that. So he called me into his office and he says, look, I have a lead at a rock station. It's part-time, weekend overnights. Again, I'm right out of Specs. I don't deserve anything more than that. Did I want to be out in the middle of the nights playing to the cornfields? No, but I wanted to be on the radio, so I didn't care. So it made $5 an hour. It was minimum wage. I was making $5 an hour. I remember that distinctly because I think I figured it out, and it was costing me more to drive from Roseville to Lapeer than what I was making an air shift.
Yeah.
And so,
I want to interject something. I want to interject something there, Renee. You mentioned Dick Kernan. That man made no beef about letting you know that that's how it was going to be. You weren't going to go on and get a job at the Riff.
Right.
You were going to Lapeer. You were going, for me, it was Ludington. You're going, and Dick, I had the same experiences. I got this guy, Ron Robinson, you need a news director, you should hire him. And the next thing I know, I'm in Ludington, Michigan. So that's how it happens. But They make no secret when you're going to school of specs, at least they didn't when we were going there in the late 90s, 2000s, is you're going to a small market. So get these pipe dreams of you working on the riff doing mornings out of your head now.
Yeah, they do not sugarcoat it, which was tough to hear at first, of course, but I appreciate that, and it's not in their best interest to sugarcoat it.
Right.
So yeah, what he didn't tell me, he told me it was a rock station. I liked rock and roll. I grew up in the 90s. I loved grunge, It was a metal station. And on the weekend overnights, it was basically a death metal station.
Gwar!
Oh, yeah. Gwar, Cradle of Filth, Coal Chamber, Lamb of God. I mean, I was
that's
like,
a rock station.
Oh my gosh. And, my mom and dad would try to tune in. My dad rigged up this crazy antenna on the roof of the house in Roseville so that he could get in my station. And it was so awful. My parents were such great cheerleaders. But so I did that, got eventually promoted to doing full-time overnights. Then I was doing 7 to midnight. And eventually I got promoted to doing the morning show with Carl Coffey, which was incredible.
Wow.
I grew up listening to him as well, the 5 o'clock funnies on CSX. So to work with, I remember the first time I met him and him just saying hello and hearing that monstrous voice that he had, that deep, heavy voice that is so distinct, and just like, I was starstruck.
What's interesting is much like you, I grew up listening to Carl Coffey. He was one of the best.
Yeah.
And I never met him. I never had an opportunity to meet him. And in fact, I did not see a picture of him until after he had passed.
Oh.
And I have to tell you, it looked nothing like you would think he would look.
No, you thought he'd be this real big guy, husky. I mean, that was my vision of him anyway. And he was just a little guy, very health conscious, which was really funny to me, because one story I will tell you about Carl Coffey was there was this little diner right by the station, and we call in an order, and he'd ask for an egg white omelet because he had to watch his cholesterol, and very health conscious, dry toast. I remember this so distinctly. And so he would come in some mornings if it was a rough morning, and he'd have Bailey's in his coffee. So he was quite a character, very much so a free spirit. And I didn't know it at the time, but I had learned so much from that guy in that moment. At times, of course, I'm 19, and I don't even know how old he was at that point, but I just remember like this crazy old man, but I learned so much from him.
So before we move on from your first radio, you said it was in Lapeer?
Yeah.
I didn't even know they had a radio station in Lapeer, because that's just north of like Port Huron, over by that area, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a small little station. Basically, you take M24 Lapeer Road and drive it for a half hour after you get off at 75, and that's.
So, did you move or did you just commute?
I did both. 2 years out there, I commuted the first year, and then the second year, after like the first bad winter, it was like, all right, I got to move out here. And thankfully, I had supportive parents that were just like, okay, so consider this as if you were living in a dorm and you're continuing your education. You went to Specs as opposed to Michigan State, so we did still save some money. So we'll help you with your rent and your groceries.
Now, I'm very curious about this next question, what your response is, because you're at your first job in Lapeer, and, we just mentioned that they preach, you're going to go start here and you're going to start there. So the question when you get to these first jobs, at least it was for me in Ludington, is how long do you stay before you start dipping your toes in the water? I remember when I was at Ludington, there was a couple of occasions where people I graduated with were already going on to their second jobs, and I was like, well, when should I do that? And I think I was at Ludington for maybe a year and a half, but it seemed like forever. You're like, okay. Yeah. So for you, what was it that led you to your next opportunity?
Well, it's so funny of how small this industry really is, because the way that I got my first gig in Detroit. So I did end up moving out to Lapeer, as I had mentioned, and I was living with a listener's mother-in-law. I had met this listener. Her name was Anna, and she was great. And she, I became friends with her and kind of filled her into with the less sexy parts of radio. The fact that I was making $5 an hour,
Right.
and, my car was barely alive. And so she knew that I needed to move out to Lapeer. And so her mother-in-law happened to be in a financial situation where she needed to take on a roommate. So I moved in with this woman. I was 20 at the time, and she was in her 60s.
Wow.
And but she was great. She was a party animal. She was a lot of fun. And she was a hairdresser. And this is what's so funny. They say sometimes it's all who you know. Here's a perfect example of that. I had been on the air about a year and a half at radio. At that time, the station flipped from Wings 103 to Radio X. It was still a rock station, but they changed the name to rebrand it because everybody used to say Wings 103 sounded like a feminine product. And Radio X kind of had more of that grunge to it, that,
Grittiness,
grit. And so I was living with this woman, and she was a hairdresser, and she's like, one of my clients is actually in radio. I said, what's his name? She said, Greg. She goes, I don't remember his last name. But anyway, get me your demo, and I'm going to pass it on to him. I said, okay. So I gave her a cassette of me doing radio in Lapeer, and it was Greg Henson. She cut his hair, which if you see Greg Henson, that's really funny that he had a hairdresser.
Right.
And so anyway, she said, hey, this is my roommate. She's really good. You need to hire her. And he goes, does she know anything about sports? Because at the time, he was on the air at DFN. And she said, no, I don't think so. No, I don't think she knows anything about sports. He's like, well, what am I going to do with this? So she told me that. I go, well, that's cool, Randy. I just appreciate that you even tried for me. Whatever. Didn't really think much about it. About 8 months later, I randomly get this phone call after I had been doing the morning show with Carl, and it was Jay Necklace, and he was the program director for 106.7, which was DFN's sister station, and at the time was, if you remember, Alice 106.7.
Yeah.
And he said, I'd love to have you come in. Let's interview. And I met with him, and he was very brutally honest with me. He said, you're very green, and really you should have a couple years experience under your belt. You don't have that. But I hear something in you, and I think that, it's time for you to maybe take it to the next level. I mean, he was very great.
Wow.
He was so
awesome.
nice. Yeah, and he said, so I'd like to offer you doing 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings. I was like,
Wow.
yes, I'm back in Detroit. I'm coming back in Detroit.
Yes.
So for a while, I was doing radio 6 days a week. So I would do this morning show with Carl Coffey. I was on the air with him Monday through Friday. Saturday nights, the radio station had me at a bar night, and I was out there from like 11 to 2 a.m. in Davison. And so after I would leave my bar night for Lapeer in Davison, I would drive to my parents, sleep 1 hour, and then get to the radio station to do but I loved it. I loved every second of it. I was on a high. And then after I got off the air Sunday morning at 10 a.m., I just died.
I want to put a pin in that because you were just talking about Greg Henson, and I want to interject here something. Greg Henson, especially when he was the PD at the Fan, developed a reputation for kind of being an asshole.
Yeah, he really did.
But I want to say that that's not been my finding. My finding is, first off, that story is a fantastic story, but I have a very similar story, except it went on the other way. I applied to work at the Fan, and I think I've been rejected maybe 3, 4, 5 jobs because a lot of jobs you get, sometimes you don't get jobs.
Right.
And he was the only guy. He was the only rejection that I got. That he sent me a letter. He sent me a letter saying thank you for sending in the tape. He gave me a couple compliments, and he goes, at this time, this isn't where we're at. I don't remember what it said. I have it, and I need to go look at it. But yeah, he was. And to me, for someone who has a reputation of being kind of an asshole, I have found Greg to be very brutally honest, but genuine. And if you talk to him, you know what you get. He's not going to backstab you. He's very straight and honest with you, and I appreciate that.
I did too. And I mean, he didn't have to pass my
Yeah.
tape on, this kid's tape in Lapeer. You know, I mean, he could have very well just tossed it in the garbage after he left the barber shop that day. So I'm so grateful that he did that. And I didn't even really know who he was at that point. And then you're right. I remember tuning in and listening, like, that's the guy that did me a solid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did that for a while. I did that for probably about 8 months. I bounced between working both jobs. So I was doing Monday through Friday in Lapeer. Eventually, he put me on Saturdays and Sundays in Detroit. And I worked there for, was it 2 years? I want to say it was about 2 years that I worked there.
Well, I think we should make a new game for radio. Instead of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, there's 6 degrees of Greg Henson.
Right.
Because seriously, like, I had no idea that you had that past with him.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
big
Greg's
Greg
great.
Henson fan. All right, so why you back in Detroit? This is where you and our lives crossed, because when you were there, I think you started working at Specs Howard or maybe got an internship there, and that's when I became a student, is in 2000, and that's where our paths have crossed. But talk about how you can, I mean, back in Detroit, if there's an opportunity at Specs, it seems like a no-brainer for you. What was that like?
So I had to leave Radio X because it was a privately owned station at the time. I don't remember his last name now, but his first name was Don. He owned our little rinky-dink radio station as well as greenhouses in Royal Oak.
Right.
So he had his hands in a few things. And all I wanted was health insurance. I had been working there 2 years.
Gotta have the
I needed
insurance.
health insurance. You know, I kept enrolling and dropping out of U of M Flint so that I could
Really?
my parents could present the letter that I was enrolled in school. And so they were catching on to that. My mom's like, you gotta come up with a plan here, you know? But I couldn't afford to go to school and do radio. So I was really in this catch-22. And so I had kept a close relationship with Donald Walker, who was the director of education at the time. And just as an instructor, when I had him at Specs, I just really admired him and looked up to him. Just, you know, you can't possibly be in a bad mood around Donald Walker.
Love Donald Walker. Another great man. Yeah.
And so I kept contact with him, and I just said, Donald, I need a pep talk. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I can't live on just radio 2 days a week. I knew I could move back home, but, you know, I was just looking for that guidance for that next step. And he goes, actually, I have a part-time thing here at the school, a lab assistant position, where basically I would walk around to those practice radio studios that they had at Specs that were like little mock radio stations to get the kids the practice of running a board and executing a show. And there were reel-to-reel machines in there at the time and carts. And he said, you know, we could use someone to just kind of, for lack of better terms, babysit, you know, and assist if a student doesn't know why their reel-to-reel isn't playing back audio. And you know, a lot of times it was walking into a studio and flipping a switch on the board that they hadn't had in the right place. He goes, it's not full time, but you know, it's about 25 hours a week. Cool. Awesome. So I was doing that. And then that's when I met you, because you were attending as a student. So I was doing that during the week and then doing radio on the weekend. So I packed up my stuff and left Randy, which she was heartbroken.
You can't go. All the plants are going to die.
I know, right? Exactly. And lived back at my mom and dad's house, which was a hard pill to swallow, but whatever.
Now, you worked at several radio stations, and we're going to get to those when you came back to Detroit, because I don't think you ever left, and you can correct me when I'm wrong when we get to that. But you did spend, I think, 15 years at Specs Howard School of Broadcast Arts. Mm-hmm. As, you know, like I met you as a student in 2000. We worked together in the mid-2000s when I came back to work there for a couple of years. But your job evolved through that institution over the years. Could you talk about that? Because 15 years is a long time to be at that school. Anyway,
Specs will always have a special place in my heart. You know, I did start as a lab assistant, and then a position opened up to be an instructor at Specs. And I say instructor because it's not a teacher. You know, teachers go to school to teach. Instructors share their craft and their knowledge of the industry, which I really didn't have much at that point, obviously. But I knew enough to teach other people. This is what I dealt with in an entry level position. And I was pretty good at editing. I don't know if I still am. I don't really have to edit all too often anymore, but
it's like riding
at the
a bike.
time,
Yeah.
So I knew enough to be of use to the students. And so they put you through this crash course on how to teach, essentially. Right. I did that, and I did that for probably about a year and a half. And as I had mentioned, I was at 106.7, and they were looking for a night person, but it was not a full-time position. Even though it was a full-time air shift, it wasn't going to pay the bills full-time. So I needed something that allowed me, I'm not turning that opportunity down. There's no way. No. I'm just not turning that down. So I needed something that allowed me to work during the day and do that at night. And so as an instructor, because they had offered classes morning, afternoon, and evenings, you had to be available essentially all times of the day throughout the week at certain points, right? And so admissions there is more of a 9-to-5 type position. And so
I think that's what you were doing when I came back to teach. I think that's what you were doing when I came back
probably.
to teach.
I spent the majority of my time at Specs in the admissions department. And it started as doing like recruiting for the local high schools, the gimmies, what is that? Warren Cousino.
Southfield. Oh, Warren Cousino.
Southfield High School. Yeah. What is that? Monroe. They have the radio station. And Plymouth Salem, I don't know if they still do or not, but going to those stations, and even some out in the Lapeer area, that they had great like VOTEC schools and programs, and just recruiting where it could be a 9-to-5. I'm on the road all day, but it's a 9-to-5 essentially. So I did that for a while. And that once 106.7 flipped to country, that position was eliminated. They went automated for a while. And so I found myself at Specs, and I was like, okay, I feel like I'm going to be here for a hot minute.
Sure.
So I need to make sure that this position is something. I want to make it my own. So I expanded the high school program greatly. I made it so that the high school person kind of worked hand in hand with the career services person so that we could tag team the entire state of Michigan, because what a better way to use your resources than go to these high schools that are in Traverse City, where these kids could come down to Specs for 8 months and then go live back at home with mom and dad, which made sense, and work at a radio station that made sense for their entry level skills.
Right.
Bring the career services person with me. They could go and talk to the radio stations and, butter them up while I'm talking to the schools. So I kind of made this dual program and did that for quite some time.
Now, while you were there, we brought him up earlier in the conversation. You got to work 15 years with one of what I think is one of the great men that I've ever had in my life, and that's Dick Kernan. What was that like to get to know that guy?
It was incredible. I mean, Dick, you just appreciated his honesty. One of the things that I'll never forget he told me was, I was only 18, 19 when I was trying to get my first job. And I had interviewed at a few different stations. And I know I didn't get it because, I could talk a good game. But when they found out how old I was, there was a problem. Even I didn't care. I was even trying for promotions, working in promotions, but I wasn't 21, and so that was a problem for me to get into bars. Like specifically, I remember interviewing at 89X, and that was a big issue. They were like, "That's great for the bars in Canada. You're 19. That's going to be a problem here." And even some of the on-air gigs that I was applying for, and Dick was like, "Don't paint the town red with your age. You come off much more mature. Unless they ask, don't." And so that was. Carl Coffey did not know until we did a promotion with the Motor City Casino that I was not 21. We took a busload of listeners when Motor City Casino had first opened, and it was supposed to be him and I. Well, obviously, there's no getting around that one.
Right.
And I tried making up excuses because they didn't even want me to tell Carl Coffey how young I was. Yeah, they were afraid he would want to work with me or something. So Carl, he thought I was in my 20s or something.
But eventually, I mean, you spent 15 years there. You got old enough. You became 21 and then some.
Yeah, and yeah, I'm 35 now, so no, yeah, I mean it's it was a young. I got into it very young, but Dick Kernan along the way always gave me really great advice and gave me the, hey, I think it's time you move on from this. Even at Specs, he's like, how long are you going to go driving around talking to high schools? It's time for something new. You have enough experience to entice these people in a different way. You have a knack for sales, which I've never planned on that, but I do. I know I do.
Yes.
Even, that's always...
Which is how you ended up at McRae, right? I mean,
yeah, it's always kind of been a backup for me. And essentially, admissions at Specs. Specs is a for-profit. It's sales. It's education, but it's sales.
You got to get butts in those classrooms.
Right, exactly. So come to find out, I was really good at sales. And so I became an admissions rep and did that for a lot of years, which to me was great. I was selling an industry I love, a program I believed in. So yeah.
But Dick Kernan was right. It was time to move on. And we will talk about that. But before we move on from Specs, we just lost him last year. I got to ask you about, another great man, Specs Howard himself. What was it like to get to know him?
Him and I, we had some really great conversations, especially towards the end of me working there, because his parking spot at the school was right outside of my office. And so he would flash his lights when he would pull up that he was ready for assistance coming in, because, he had polio. And so the man walked with a walker a good chunk of his life. And so if it wasn't myself that was able to help him, he had like 3 or 4 people. But a lot of times it was me, because I was right there. I'd wave to him and I'd go out there and help him bring his stuff in. And just that small little walk from his car to his office, we had some of the greatest conversations. And I'll never forget the one day he said, hey, I actually caught you on the air this morning, because I was filling in at whatever radio station I was at the time. And it was like, the first time you could tell your parents are really proud of you for something that you did. Yep. It was that rush over me. Like, I couldn't even speak. I was like, thank you, sir. Thank you. I wanted to cry. I wanted to hug him. I think I did do both, actually. And just hearing his stories and, of the good old days, that even if I couldn't relate to it because it was, the way radio was before I got into it. It was so fascinating, and that man was such a great storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, he could spin some yarn, so no question.
He knew the true art of painting the picture, and he was so good at that. He was just so dynamic, and even just the way he told a story. Like, I just wanted to be one of his grandkids that he sat and read a bedtime story to, because he was just so good and dynamic and amazing, and I miss him.
A great man. Him and Dick. Well, in 2010, I believe, you were tapped to be a co-host with another Detroit luminary, Jay Towers. Talk about your time when you went to Clear Channel there. That was a great opportunity to do a morning show, right?
Yeah. So in between working at 106.7, which at that time had just become Clear Channel, and like I said, they had gone and flipped to a country form. I think they were called the Fox. I don't even remember what they were called. That station has flipped its name and format so many times. Alex Tier, who's also a Specs grad, he was a good friend of the school and was always doing things, a huge advocate. He'd come in to visit, and he offered me to do weekends there. So for a while, I was working at DRQ when it was 93.1 DRQ, and I was doing Specs. And so I get this phone call let me backtrack one more time. I worked there for 8 months. DRQ flipped on April Fool's Day. What was that, 2000? Was that 2009?
I want to say it was 2009. It might have been. Well, I think it could have been 2010. I don't know. I don't know what happened last Thursday. Stop.
I know, right? So it was 2009 or 2010, and so everybody, as we all know, got blown out, and they went automated to Doug FM. It was awful. Oh. However, their sister station, 96.3 WDVD, at that time we were still taking meter readings, and they hadn't thought that through. So they needed somebody there to physically take meter readings on the overnight. And they called me. They fired us like at noon. And they called me about 6 o'clock that night. And they were like, so, hi, friend. Would you want to come back and, I don't know, just do an overnight shift on DVD? Because we need somebody to take meter readings. And I was like, I will do it for 2 weeks if you will find me a job. I'm not saying it needs to be full time. I just want to do a weekend shift. Well, our new PD's starting soon, and you can talk to him about that. I was like, great, what's his number? I'm calling the guy. Like, I felt like, what's the worst they could say? No, and I worked for 2 weeks.
It probably worked out the other way. Like, you were like, oh, look at this chick and her initiative.
Yeah,
and
so that it worked out perfectly, and I ended up working there for quite some time. I was there for a few years, actually. But, no, it had to have been 2000, now that I'm thinking this through, because I was at DVD for a few years. It had to have been about 2006.
Wow.
No,
okay.
2005. I don't know. We'll have to look that up. But I worked at DVD for a few years and was just doing weekends and working at Specs. Then I get this phone call from Jay Towers that they're looking to start this new morning show at NIC. Well, first he couldn't even tell me where. That he's looking to start this new morning show. And I said, where? Well, I can't tell you. But can we meet up and do an audition? Your name, has been brought up a few times. Sure, great. And so I met up with him. Him and I, we did a couple of auditions in the Clear Channel building. So I knew that much, that it was going to be Clear Channel. I didn't know what station. So I knew either somebody was getting fired or was 106.7 going to flip again.
Could be. Never know.
Right. And so one thing led to another, and we were brought on to do a show together, and we did that for 3 years.
And what was that like? Because now you're doing morning show stuff. But to this point, it's because that's a different animal in radio. That's a very team collaborative type of environment. And I mean, I've told you many times how talented I think you are. Well, but that's not something that you can learn at Specs. You had that something extra. But my question, I guess, is what was the dynamic? Because it wasn't just you and Jay, rather. There was a group of you. How did that morning show, how did you feel it turned out?
I think that it wasn't given enough time to hit its stride. They started dismantling the show before I think that we were given, we had Dan, Jenna, who are our producers, and we actually lost Dan last year. But we had Dan and Jenna, who were both very young producers. Both were Specs grads, Jay and myself. Jay had morning show experience because he was on DRQ back in the day. Right. He was doing Fox 2 part-time. He had been on 97.1 when it was... what was it? 97.1 talk radio. I don't remember what it wasn't.
Yeah, sports. Before it was the fan. Before the fan.
Yeah,
I mean not the fan, but before the ticket. I'm sorry.
Right,
before the ticket.
Right. So Jay had a lot of experience, and I had done just minimal morning radio in Lapeer. I love Carl Coffey, and again, I learned a lot from him. But playing to cornfields and playing to Detroit on a heritage station like NIC is completely different. Playing to females as opposed to a bunch of dudes that probably haven't gone to bed yet, coming off of a bender during the week.
Right.
So there was a bit of a learning curve, and we were all kind of learning it together. And we really, I felt, had started hitting a stride, and they let both of our producers go. And then shortly after, I was let go. And I say that we were hitting a stride because it was really funny. The day after they let me go, HR called me to say that I would be getting a separate check coming in the mail from, what my severance package was looking like. I said, for what? She said, well, you guys hit your ratings bonus.
Oh, my gosh.
I mean,
how about that?
How about that, right? So whatever, management pulled the trigger quickly, and nothing, new management had come in. That's pretty common in radio. No hard feelings. I'm just still taking that in because that's crazy. To me, that's
that in a nutshell is what happened to radio when you have the combination of technology with these people being able to buy hundreds and thousands of stations and water them down with no consideration of what impact any specific show on any radio station would have. They didn't care. It was about cutting numbers.
Yeah, and I can guess and speculate all day long as to what I think may have really happened. What good does it do? I just wish we would have been given.
Yeah, you felt shortchanged.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it really did. Because again, as I had mentioned early on, a station, a radio station, and a show are all considered new for a couple of years. Yeah. And that's something I've heard throughout my whole career. And my boss today still reiterates it to us because he goes, "You guys are so comfortable talking about Goose and I. It's so hard to believe that you haven't even been on a year, and I can't even imagine where you're going to be in a year from now with your sound. You're still so new, you're infants, So in that time, in that 3-year time that I was on with Jay, we had, started the show from the ground up. We had changed the name of the radio station because it was WNIC. Then for a while it was Fresh 100.3, and they were trying to shift to a younger demographic. That backfired. So then they were going back to WNIC. So now we don't have consistency. We've confused the listener. After you've had this heritage station, heritage morning show through the years, I just don't think it was given a fair shot to really get its legs or its roots and,
Well, talk about, the advantage of having specs as a backdrop. That was because but even with that, I think in 2013, it wasn't too long after that you started, you were on the air at 98.7 WDZH, the amp. Mm-hmm. Talk about this.
Boy, that was, that's when I started feeling my age. I had to lie about my age in the other direction.
Uh-oh.
Amp radio, it was fun. I felt like I was learning radio all over again because until this point, I was on stations for the most part that were a little bit of an older demographic, right? Females 25-54. This was females 18 to 34. And while it doesn't seem like it would be that much of a difference, CHR is so different. It's, just the way that the station sounds, like in your headphones, like physically sounds. They put echo and reverb to make it sound more hip, to the music just constantly having that forward momentum. You don't stop down. It was a new challenge because you had to come up with good breaks, and you didn't have the luxury of large stop sets, time to just step down and talk. You had to keep it moving. The momentum was always a forward motion. So it was a whole new challenge. I loved it. I felt really old, but I loved it. And so I worked there for a couple of years. I want to say I was there about 2 years.
2 years, I think.
Yep. And then I got a phone call from Blaine Fowler at 96.3 asking if I would be interested in doing some part-time work, or joining I'm so used to saying part-time, doing mornings with him, that he was looking for a new co-host. And that was something that I was interested in. They ended up going with Lauren, which is a smart decision. She's like the queen. She is so good on that station. But I was offered a position anchoring locally America's Morning Show at the time is what it was called on, at the time, Nash FM. Still
Nash
country
FM.
format.
Yeah.
Yep. And the way that it was set up was Blair and his producer were in Nashville. And I would come on and do the local hits. So your traffic, weather, any major news update if need be for Detroit. And we evolved the show to where we would record these segments. We would do like 15 segments a week. So like 3 a day would record where it was Blair and I talking through satellite to just kind of make it sound like we had some local flair to the station. We never made it sound like we were together, but we used to say he's holding down, all of the pulse in Nashville, and I was taking care of it in Detroit.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was cool. It was a cool concept, and we were kind of like a test market. They were testing us out to see if this would work in other markets that carried the Nash FM, America's Morning Show. Eventually, they got rid of Blair and brought on Ty Kelly and Chuck, and we continued that process. It became even a little bit more intense than that. Like I would go out to Nashville, they would fly them in here, so it was even more.
That's cool.
Yeah, they would do big broadcasts like Lions home opener. They would have them out here for that, or if Kenny Chesney was in town, the big shows, big events. They would bring them out here, or they would have me go out there like, hey, look, we're hanging out.
Yeah, I'm sure you met and interviewed quite a few country acts and artists, and I'm sure that was a fun time.
It was amazing. I can honestly say I've been fortunate enough to meet 90% of the big country artists right now. And who
are some of the ones that you enjoyed the most in that era?
Luke Bryan is just a flippin' riot. I had so much fun with that guy. I've been lucky to meet him twice. And he's so cool. Dustin Lynch, great time. Keith Urban.
Is there anybody more talented than that guy?
Let me tell you something. Let me tell you my Keith Urban story. It's one of my more proud moments. Not really.
Oh, I got to hear this now.
So I did not know that I was going to have an opportunity to interview him backstage at Pine Knob. And my PD, I knew I was going to meet him. I didn't know I was going to interview him. So I didn't really prepare for that. And furthermore, his radio room is fantastic, okay? He had this for a guy that's dry and sober, he puts on a party. So his radio room, he had this whole like Rat Pack martini bar themed. It was so cool back there. I took advantage, okay? I took advantage because that's what it's there for. And it's one of the cool perks of radio. Well, my PD says to the record person, hey, is there any chance she can do a quick interview with Keith Urban? I looked at, no.
What are you doing that for? Well, you're ruining my buzz.
I know. I was like, I haven't prepared anything. And if you've ever tried to go on the internet on your phone at a concert at Pine Knob, it's impossible. I'm like trying to search stuff. I just was not prepared at all. And I have a buzz on, a good one. So I sit down and I do this interview. I'll have to send you the video of it. It's hilarious.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
And I said, so Keith, you smell good. And I sniff him.
Wow. Well.
Yeah. And then fortunately, news had come out that I had heard the night before he got into town, and he was jamming with Bob Seger. Like they had a jam session. So thank God I had that to work on. I made it work, but I sniffed him. I told him, I don't know, I was talking smack to him. I don't know where your people are. Those are my people. One day, Keith Urban, you'll have people. Like I was just
listen,
mess.
if you ever decide to sit down and write your biography, the title should be "And I Sniffed Keith Urban." That should be the title. And I sniffed Keith Urban.
So fast forward, that was probably 5-6 years ago. Fast forward to this past summer when Keith Urban was once again at Pine Knob. A lot of these artists weren't doing in-person interviews because COVID's still a thing, and I get it. You know, they're very much so in a bubble, a lot of them, because that'll throw off their whole tour. And so we did a phone interview with Keith Urban, and the person comes on the line and says, Keith, you're on with Goose and Renee. And he goes, Renee, it's been a long time. It's been a few years. How are you, old friend? And I was like, oh my God.
How do you forget someone that sniffed you? How do you do it? I was
so horrified. I couldn't even
talk. Have you told Goose what had happened before then, or did he ask for an explanation?
I did. And I said to him, I go, I have like a PTSD, not an anxiety that he was going to remember that, because let's think of how many people Keith Urban meets in a day. Right. You know, I had.
But how many sniff him? How many sniff him? I'm just saying. How many sniff him?
Yeah, well, there's that. And usually security probably hauls those people away. So yeah, I had such anxiety over doing that interview for no good reason. Well, for good reason. And then when he came on and he did that, it just escalated it to pure almost panic attack. I couldn't talk. Goose had to jump in. I was like,
That's hilarious.
You remember. That's what I said. You remember.
It's been a long time. How are you? Well, that's a great story. And I want to go back because earlier you mentioned Carl Coffey. Also, why you were at Nash, isn't it? Didn't you? Isn't this where you met Doug Podell? No.
Yeah. So Doug was no longer working at the Riff, and he came on and he was doing part-time with Nash. And who knew Doug's love of country music? I never knew that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the guy just loves music, period.
Well, I will tell you this, and it's in my docuseries. I actually play an air check because most people forget he's the Doc of Rock, but most people forget W4 turned country, and he stayed there, and he was turning records. So I actually found an air check of him taking a caller that was, I think he was the caller was requesting a Bed of Roses, and Doug was like, "Yeah, we could play that for you," because yeah. So Doug Podell, yeah, he's a country guy. Who knew? He's the Doc of music.
Yeah, I did not know. I had no idea. And there was videos of him karaokeing some country music.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was awesome. And of course, I only worked with him for a couple months because I left there shortly after that. But of course, I mean, it was Doug Podell. How awesome is that? Right.
He's the Doc of Rock. Something you do have in common, and I just thought of it. It wasn't even on my question list, but I mentioned Doug Podell with the phones. He got that love of using the phones, I think, from Lee Allen. But you are very good at working the phones and using them even days, if not weeks later. Now, for someone who's watching or listening who may not know, what do the phones have to do with radio? It's an art form. Talk about how important and how you implement the phones into your radio programs, whether it be mornings or a regular air shift.
The interaction that you have with your listeners, the listeners can be an extension of your show. They are an extension of your show. And sometimes you might have a so-so break, and your listeners are what make it. And so that's exactly why it's so important to pick up that phone anytime it rings and listen to what they have to say. And there's been a few times that Goose and I have been on the air, and we had no idea the turn that a phone call would take, that it took a break that we thought would be pretty good and just escalated it to the next level. So, it's important because you just don't know. Plus, it gives your listeners an opportunity to connect with you. And as my PD always reminds us, one listener at a time. If we're the show that put them on the air or, gave them that opportunity, and maybe they never got to go on the air at the competition, let's say, then that's awesome. One listener at a time. But also, especially when you're doing a solo show, like just a regular jock show, middays, afternoons, or whatever, it's just that added interaction.
Right.
And you're right. I love taking a phone call. Every phone call, I tell them, yeah, I'm going to get that song on for you. Or I always ask them what they're doing, because sometimes, who cares what song you want to hear? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. But I care about what you're doing. And maybe you're going to have a great story. And they tell me, I don't care if they tell me, where are you going to work? What do you do? What are you having for lunch? If you keep digging, you're going to get something out of them that you can use.
And what I love about doing a morning show as opposed to experiencing that when you're doing an air shift is when you get that one call and you look at each other and it's like you get this, it's like a high.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, I hit a home run. Now I get to trot around the bases. This call is taking radio. It's like, good radio, and this caller is taking your bit to a level that you didn't even entertain the idea of anything like this happening. Boom. And it's just great radio. But sharing that with someone and being able to just do it with a look, and you're both like, it's Christmas morning and I just got the coolest gift ever.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
And I'm learning the crazier and wackier and off the wall they are, the better. Because everyone goes, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
Like we had a guy the other day that I don't even remember what the topic was. But he goes, hey, Renee, you want a good pot roast recipe? What? It It was absolutely nothing to do anything with cooking, what we were talking about.
That's hilarious.
Sure. And he just rambled on this recipe.
It's a great recipe. You and your husband, you and your fiance are going to love it. It's great.
Yeah.
All right, so you spent a couple years at the Nash FM. In 2018, I think that was the year, you moved over to 98.7 The Breeze. Talk about that.
Yeah, so Nash FM was part of Cumulus, or not was. It was, yeah, because Nash FM is no longer. It was part of Cumulus, and as you know, they filed for bankruptcy around that time. And so a lot of cuts had to be made, and essentially, they said I could stay on, but for a fraction of what I was making, and that just was not going to work for me. I couldn't live on that.
Right.
And so I, again, always having a backup plan. At that point, I had left Specs because I was getting to the station at like 5 a.m. and I would have been working at Specs till 6 p.m. And that's just 13-hour days consistently. That's your life. I couldn't do that. Right. I know a lot of people can, but I couldn't. So I took a job part-time. The owner of Macrae Harbor is a good friend of mine. And so, before any of this had come about, him and I one night had some drinks. Why? I'm going to sound really like I have a drinking problem.
The secret's out. The secret's out.
I know, right? And he's like, I just bought this marina because I was a member there. I kept my boat there. I said, really? Because I really want to turn this place into like a resort type place. And I just started spewing these ideas like of what I felt he could do. And it was not so much of, look at me, I have so many good ideas. I was just speaking pretty much as a member on what I would have liked to have seen at the marina. So when I left Nash FM, I was like, okay, so now what? Now I need a job. And so they offered to keep me on Nash part-time. When I told them I'm not doing full-time for that. Well, do you want to stay on part-time? No. Was my ego a little bruised? Yeah.
Right.
But I left there and I went and did the sales and marketing position at Macrae and did some really cool events. It forced me to kind of reinvent myself. I became a promo person. I became their marketing person. I had to self-teach myself graphic design, for social media and their flyers. I was doing everything from that to this newsletter for the members to, making the menus for the restaurant. So it was really cool. It forced me to have to learn again. And I was working at 98.7 part-time, which was the Breeze. It was funny because when I started there, it was still AMP radio. And they flipped to Christmas music. And I remember asking Tim Roberts, is this a format flip? Nope, we'll be back. And I believed him because it's Tim Roberts. I believed him. But they had also hired this Nathan guy. I think his last name was Graham. He was my PD for 2 weeks. The guy had just up and moved to Detroit from, I don't even remember where. I don't even think he unpacked. And he was let go. And I thought for sure it was a format flip because of the Christmas music. A new PD is here. It had all the making. And then when they let him go, I went, okay, maybe it's not a format flip. Well, it was. But it became the Breeze, and Tim Roberts just handled the duties himself. So that was really interesting. And I said to him, so do I assume that I'm done here? I'm not needed? Because they didn't have any jocks on the air for a couple of weeks. No, we're going to need you. But I had seen that they had cleared out a lot of the jocks. What I did notice was they kept all the older ones.
Uh-oh. And now before you were too young, now you're too old, right?
Well, before I was too old, now I'm too young. Well, let me tell you, I've never spun yacht rock. It is my guilty pleasure. I freaking love it. Foreigner Journey all day long. Let's go.
Talking about some of my favorite things, Lou Graham.
Yes.
Love that guy.
Yes, it was so good.
Midnight Blue is song number 1. Midnight Blue, song number 1.
I am so sad that they did not give that format a shot. They killed that pretty quickly. And it was such a great station.
Yeah. So, you're at McRae's. The pandemic's happening, and the trend is going the other way, where there's more people in radio losing their jobs than getting jobs. How did it come to be that you came back to DRQ? Talk about this.
So, like I was kind of mentioning earlier, I was off the air for almost 2 years. Tim Roberts called me and he said, unfortunately, I have to let you go. Odyssey's forcing us to lay everyone off during this pandemic. And at that point, we all thought this was going to be a couple-month thing. He said, my goal is to bring everybody back as much as possible, but for the time being, I have to take you off payroll. I said, okay. And, I didn't take it personal. It was everyone. There was like 3 people allowed in the building at a time. So
right.
it was strange times. And so I was just working at McRae. As we all know, that this thing lasted much longer than any of us thought it was going to be. And they were getting very creative with doing radio without skipping a beat, pandemic and all. And I just thought, wow, well, I've been in radio 20 some years. Well, I had a good run. If this is it,
sure,
that's fine. And so I was off the air almost 2 years. And then that was when Blaine called me and said that Lauren was going on maternity and that he was going to need someone. And he goes, I'm not guaranteeing anything. Afterwards, maybe perhaps you can meet with David Corey, the program director, and maybe at the very least he can offer you some weekends. And then, honestly, I thought that was what maybe I would have been offered. And so, he goes, but it is an 8-week gig. I'm like, it's going to give me my radio fix for 2 months. Heck yeah. And he had the best time. Blaine Fowler is just one of the most talented guys in this market. And he's so kind and so humble. I really see him like a big brother. And he gave me great advice. And then David Corey, my program director, reached out to me and was like, hey, can we chat? And I remember telling my fiance, I was like, he wants to go to lunch. Oh my gosh, maybe he's going to offer me something. And he goes, no, he probably just wants to thank you for doing what you're doing. Don't get your hopes up. It's like, he's a busy guy. I think he's going to offer me weekends. He's not just going to have lunch with me.
Right.
So when he hit me with, hey, you ever thought about doing a morning show again? I was like, what the what? I was so excited.
When I think I'm out, they pull me back.
I know. I genuinely thought that I was done with radio. And it was funny because I started dating my fiance at the beginning of the pandemic. And so he only knew me to do part-time on The Breeze.
Sure.
And he's a hardcore sports radio guy.
Right.
Like Valenti, he has a man crush on him,
He's good at what he does, no question.
No, without a doubt. So he had no idea who I was, which is fine. And so he just knew I did this little weekend radio thing, and it was cute. He'd listen. So to go back into this whirlwind of doing morning radio, it's taken a little getting used to. The fact.
Well, let me ask you this. I have to ask you this. You brought it up and you teed it up for me because you could say that my first marriage was let's say it went through divorce because of things I was probably doing on my morning show when I was doing that. Are you a little bit worried because this is a different animal than you having an air shift? Because when you do a morning show, you have to give of yourself. If you want to be worth your salt, you have to relay your life experiences. That has to come out. And sometimes, most of the time, that's not very good and conducive to a relationship. Have you guys had this discussion?
Oh, yeah. It's been brought up a couple times.
It's been mentioned, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's been a couple of occasions that I've heard not everything's for the radio.
Yeah. Yes, it is, dear.
I mean, it is. Yes, there's a way to handle it. And it's not just him, but it's my family and his family. Sure. It's my life. That's my life. Of course, I respect their wishes, and I'm not going to blast anything too ultra personal without asking them first. But, perfect example, one of my nicknames for him, he asked me not to say it on the air. I'm sure he doesn't want it on a podcast either, but here we go. One of my nicknames for him is Poops, because the guy's always pooping. So, I talked about him the other day, and I called him Poops. And he's like,
nice.
Can you just not call me Poops on the air?
Just please don't embarrass me.
Right.
That's wonderful. So coming full circle, I have a couple follow-up questions after I mentioned Goose and Renee again, but we talked a little bit at the top of the show. you had some chemistry with a couple women that could come on and do the show. What was it about you and Goose that they said, okay, I think this is our team?
What was really funny about that was I didn't meet Goose until he was hired. I had no say whatsoever. My boss said to me the one day, he goes, "We found your co-host." I was like, "Great, what's his name? Who is he?" "I can't tell you yet." "And you guys start in 2 weeks." "What?"
How's that going to work?
So they brought him in. Him and we met in my boss's office. Hey, gave him a hug. Actually, I vaguely remembered him from my time working at Specs. He was a Specs student.
Oh.
So I knew of him. I didn't know much about him. And honestly, we went and met for coffee. We had a meeting with our boss just to kind of discuss the vision of the show that he had and the direction he wanted things to go in. And he goes, "So, you guys go grab a coffee downstairs in the Fisher building and talk and get to know each other." So we sat there for like 2 hours. We came back upstairs. My boss was like, "How'd it go?" Type deal. "Oh, it's great." "Okay, well, we'll all be in talks and, we're going to grow from here." We left. I looked at him as we were waiting for the elevator. I go, "You want to go get a beer?" And then we were together for like 4 hours after that day. So
when you were a teacher, not when you were a teacher, but when you were an employee at Specs Howard, he came through as a student?
He did.
And you vaguely remembered him doing that?
Vaguely remembered him. Again, I was bouncing around. When he was there, I was in that transition of being an instructor to going on the road recruiting for Specs.
I'm sure he remembered you, no?
No, he didn't.
No? Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. All right, well, so Goose and Renee, it's flourishing. What are you finding the most challenging to traverse this? Because at the end of the day, when you're doing radio in a market like Detroit, let alone a morning show with so much competition, I mean, there is a lot of competition. What's your stance? How do you guys go about your day to get the best ratings you can?
He and I early on said that all we can do is be our authentic selves. We don't use actors. I'm just going to say it. I won't mention who, but there are some stations and shows that do. We will never do that. We're going to talk about life. Huh?
That's me. I think that's lazy.
I do too.
I think it's lazy.
I do too. And I think you're lying to your audience, and that's all part of the whole being authentic. You can't lie to your audience. The second they find out, you've betrayed them and they're not going to listen to you anymore.
Right.
We realize, one, the station's numbers were in the garbage and we could only go up.
Yeah.
When we got together, we understood the challenge that was ahead of us. Having been in that position where the station's numbers were garbage at that point, and knowing that we're going up against a lot of heritage shows, talented shows in this market, your Mojos, your heritage stations, your 100.3s, so I mean, we're very aware of what we've got to put the work in, and we have to earn that respect, and radio, people are creatures of habit when it comes to radio. They know what they listen to. We all have our routines in life, and what radio station you listen to is no exception. And that's why my boss is always reiterating to us, one listener at a time, every day, a new listener. And, again, him and I feel like we've been on together much longer than we have, but every single day somebody will call us and they'll go, "I love you guys. I just found you. I just started listening to you this week." So, that's reminders that we've come a long way, but we still have a long way. And it seems like the company is invested in us in the long haul. And just, they know, too, that this isn't going to happen overnight. We were seeing really great growth month to month from April until Christmas. And then, of course, Christmas just decimates everything.
Well, because of the Christmas music, people lose their minds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So.
Well, how long before we see you on a billboard? I'm waiting.
Oh, I don't want to see me on a billboard. No. I got this nose. I don't need it magnified times 10 on a billboard.
So we talked a little bit about earlier about that great Keith Urban story, and obviously your career is far from over. Some say it's you're in your prime, but talk to me about who is your favorite interview or encounter that you've had with an artist or celebrity?
One of my favorite interviews ever wasn't even an artist; it was an actor, Jason Bateman. He was just such a great interview. He acted like he knew us. You and I both know that guy, I don't even remember what we interviewed him for. This is when I was on with Towers, but he was doing this interview junket,
Was it for Horrible Bosses, maybe?
It may have been. Now that you say that, it may have been. But the way he talked to us and interacted with us, he would address us by our names, like
Very
we were
personal,
good friends. Yeah. He'd ask us questions, like he doesn't care.
Right.
But he was so cool and genuine and funny. He was probably one of my favorite interviews.
I don't know if you're a little younger than me. Thank goodness, I'll always be older than you. But I first saw Jason Bateman on a show called It's Your Move. I was maybe 8-9 years old. And he was on where he played a little kid, and him and his mom, his single mom, moved into this apartment complex. And the whole show was how he would have like a one-upment competition with their new landlord who was trying to date his mom. And it was brilliant writing, and I was like, this guy is a star. And the next thing I knew, he did Teen Wolf 2, and I thought his career was over. But no, my favorite Jason Bateman role is from Dodgeball when he plays that analyst. I love Jason Bateman. Jason Bateman. Population you, bro. Yeah, I love Jason Bateman.
He just seems like a genuine good guy.
Yes. But I have to ask you, I mean, that's a great memory, but you've shared this with me, and I want you to share it with my viewers and listeners, if you would, is your interesting encounters, plural, with one Ed Sheeran. Because this is funny, too.
Ed Sheeran came into the studios at NIC, and it was when A-Team, like his first single, had hit.
Right.
And he wanted, I was just trying to be like he didn't have a crew. He had like his local record guy. And so it was early in the morning, and I was like, is there anything that I can get you? Do you want a cup of coffee or something? And he was like, yeah. Can I get a cup of coffee, cream, sugar? Do you have butter? Butter. Yes, he wanted butter. The dude drank coffee with butter. And come to find out, that was I guess that's a thing in Britain.
Interesting.
I had no idea.
Never heard of
that.
Yeah.
So here we are, all trying, going into the employee fridge. Does anybody got any butter laying around in here?
Yeah.
Maybe from carryouts or something. I'm like, sorry, we didn't have butter.
That's memorable for sure.
Oh yeah, it was awesome.
Because again, you saw him years later, didn't you? And you guys had a similar conversation.
Yeah, I brought that up to him. He had just he had exploded. We had him for. When I was at 98.7 AMP radio, we had brought him on for whatever our summer concert was called. I can't remember now. And I brought that story up to him, and he actually remembered it. So he was like, the look on your face when I asked for butter.
Funny. It's funny you didn't remember him as a great musician. You just remember
I remembered him.
Like butter.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I mean, I love Ed Sheeran. I'm a total fan. But yeah, that's what comes to my mind is his way of taking coffee.
That's too funny. Now, one of my final questions always has to do with the state of current radio today, Renee. Obviously, it's not what it was when we first got into the business. It's evolved and changed. And as I talked to Fred Jacobs last week, or when I talked to Fred, radio still gets the lion's share, but because there's so much competition, it's not nearly the phenomenon that it was or important to us on a daily basis. But with that said, from your point of view as someone who's currently doing a morning show and doing it successfully in Detroit, in your purview, what is the state of radio today, and what would you do in the future to make it a better product for more people to tune in?
The state of radio right now, I'm not going to say I love it. I think live and local is always your best option. Right. And if you can't be live and local, sounding at least live and local I think that we owe that to our listeners. I'll be the first to admit, I used to voice track for a show in Santa Barbara and Oxnard. I did that show for 7 years, and I would record it days in advance, and no one knew none the different. And my ratings were pretty good. I was on middays every day. Never had set foot in either of anywhere in that area in California. Did I feel a little guilty doing that? Of course, especially being someone who struggled, being in radio, as we all know, is a very unstable business. And especially when you can pay someone a fraction of what a real salary should be, yeah, you feel a little guilty taking that on. However, it's almost become, in some cases, fortunately not with Cumulus, but in some stations, that's part of your job description. If you are a talent in Detroit, you may be required to voice track up to 5 different other cities. It's an option. It's definitely an option in other markets for us, but it's not required. And I think that there's a big difference with that. With smart speakers, that makes things interesting too. I'm blown away that of all the technology and how far we've come with technology, how have we not figured out a better way of gauging listenership?
Right. Yeah.
You're
right about that.
It's still so inaccurate. People meters are still inaccurate. Now you've got your smart speakers. How are they gauging that? Is it, how do you know, short of if, like, I have 3 smart speakers that I have given to different members of my family now. They're still all registered under my account. And so when my mom is listening to whatever radio station, is that counting as me being in that 25-54 demographic? It's so,
right. Yeah.
It's just so crazy how inaccurate, and I don't know what the answer is to that. I wouldn't, I'd be doing something much more than a morning show if I knew the answer. But I just can't believe that we haven't figured out a way to gauge that more accurately. And if we could gauge that more accurately, I think that radio would be different. Again, because I think that the live and local aspect of it is so important. And you would really see that if we could more accurately gauge listenership.
Very good. Anything you want to add?
I love Ron Robinson. He's my favorite person. I always look forward to doing these things.
I'm so good at taking compliments. You're so lovely.
No, genuinely, you're one of my favorite people, and I will never not do anything you ever ask me to. So I hope I'm invited in the future.
Yes.
To do something.
And I also want to throw it back at you and say congratulations on your recent engagement. You're absolutely glowing. Congratulations to you and Dave.
Thank you.
And hopefully Dave can yeah. Let me see that again. You got to put closer. You got to bling, bling, bling. Renee, I want to thank you for so much for coming on. Thanks for being a part of this upcoming documentary as well. That'll be coming out soon about the history of radio. Thank you so much.
I can't wait.
Renee, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you again for tuning in to Radio Dayz The Podcast. Today's show was brought to you by Team 71 Mortgage Group. First-time home buyers get up to $10,000 to use for a down payment. Call Brian at 810-444-6466. Today's show is produced by Ron Robinson Studios. If you need professional marketing videos, professional photography, headshots, maybe you need drone video, head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com. While you're there, you can also hear previous episodes of this podcast there as well. And if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming documentary series about the history of radio, Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio, click on the Radio Dayz The Link movie under the documentaries tab at, you guessed it, ronrobinsonstudios.com. Thanks for checking out the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.
You can't go. All the plants are going to die.